Please, I'll work harder, I promise." The leather strap cut across her back again, and 17-year-old Mary Elizabeth collapsed to her knees in the dusty Colorado dirt, her torn dress already stained with blood. Above her, the cruel smile of her stepfather's business partner gleamed in the afternoon sun. "That's enough talking, girl. You belong to me now." Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. But that was before Jake Morrison rode into Redemption Creek that fateful September day in 1887, his weathered face shadowed by the brim of his black hat, his steel-gray eyes taking in everything, including the broken girl being dragged toward the saloon's back door. Let me take you back to where it all began, to a story that will remind you that sometimes the most wounded hearts are capable of the deepest love, and that redemption can come riding in on a dusty trail when you least expect it. The golden hour light was fading over the small frontier town of Redemption Creek, painting the wooden buildings in shades of amber and rust. Tumbleweeds danced across the main street while the church bell in the distance tolled 6 times, its bronze voice carrying across the desert like a prayer. This was a place where survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant keeping your soul intact in a world that seemed determined to crush it. And in this unforgiving landscape, 2 broken souls were about to discover that sometimes salvation comes not from above, but from the unexpected kindness of a stranger's heart. What Jake Morrison didn't expect that day was to witness a young woman's dignity being stripped away in broad daylight. He'd ridden into Redemption Creek with nothing more than a need for supplies and maybe a hot meal, his horse's hooves kicking up dust clouds that caught the late afternoon light. The town looked like a dozen others he'd passed through, weathered wooden storefronts, a saloon with swinging doors, and the inevitable sheriff's office with its barred windows. But something in the air felt different, charged with a tension that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. That's when he heard the crack of leather against flesh. Jake reined in his horse, Ranger, and listened. Another crack, followed by a girl's muffled cry. His jaw tightened as he guided Ranger toward the sound, coming around the corner of Henderson's General Store to witness a scene that made his blood run cold. A girl, couldn't be more than 17, was on her knees in the dirt behind the Silver Dollar Saloon. Her dark brown hair had fallen from its pins, creating a curtain that partially hid her face. But Jake could see the tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. The back of her simple blue dress was torn and stained with blood. Standing over her was a man Jake recognized from wanted posters. Silas Crane, a cattle rustler, and worse. In his meaty hands, Crane held a leather strap, and his face wore the expression of a man who took pleasure in causing pain. "You're gonna learn your place, girl," Crane was saying, raising the strap again. "Your stepfather's debt is paid with your hide now." The girl tried to scramble away, but Crane grabbed a fistful of her hair. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying a refined Eastern accent that seemed out of place in this harsh landscape. "I'll work in the saloon, I'll clean, I'll cook. Anything. Just please don't." "You'll do what I tell you, when I tell you," Crane snarled. "And right now, I'm telling you to shut your mouth and take what's coming." Jake had seen enough. He swung down from Ranger in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The sound made Crane look up, and the man's cruel smile faltered when he saw Jake approaching. "This ain't your business, stranger," Crane said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Jake walked with the measured pace of a man who'd faced down trouble before and won. His hand rested casually on the grip of his Colt .45, and his steel-gray eyes never left Crane's face. Funny thing about that, Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm making it my business. The girl looked up then, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest. Her eyes were the color of autumn leaves, golden brown with flecks of green, and they held a mixture of fear and desperate hope that nearly broke his heart. Despite the dirt and tears, he could see she was beautiful. But more than that, there was something in her face that spoke of intelligence and inner strength. You know who I am, Morrison? Crane asked, having apparently recognized him. I know you're about 10 seconds away from eating dirt if you don't drop that strap and walk away. Crane's hand moved toward his gun, but Jake was faster. The Colt appeared in his hand like magic, the barrel pointed steadily at Crane's chest. I wouldn't, Jake said softly. For a long moment, the only sounds were the distant piano music from the saloon and the girl's labored breathing. Then Crane dropped the strap and raised his hands. This ain't over, Morrison. The girl belongs to me fair and square. I got papers. Then you can take those papers and file them with the territorial judge. Until then, she stays with me. Crane's face darkened, but he knew better than to press his luck against Jake Morrison's reputation. He backed away slowly, then turned and stalked toward the saloon. Jake holstered his gun and knelt beside the girl, careful not to touch her without permission. Are you hurt badly? She tried to speak, but only managed a small sob. Jake shrugged out of his duster and draped it gently around her shoulders, noting how she flinched at even his careful touch. My name's Jake Morrison. What's yours? Mary Elizabeth, she whispered. Mary Elizabeth Hartwell. Well, Miss Hartwell, how about we get you somewhere safe and tend to those wounds? She looked up at him with those remarkable eyes, and Jake saw something in them that he recognized, the look of someone who'd learned not to trust kindness because it usually came with a price. But something about the way this dangerous stranger had risked himself for her sake made Mary Elizabeth want to believe that maybe, just maybe, there were still good men left in this harsh world. What Mary Elizabeth didn't know was that kindness could feel more terrifying than cruelty when you'd forgotten what it looked like. Jake helped her to her feet with the gentleness of a man handling something precious and fragile. His calloused hands were warm and steady, and Mary Elizabeth found herself leaning into his strength despite every instinct telling her not to trust anyone. Can you ride? Jake asked, studying her face with those penetrating gray eyes. I think so. Her voice was barely above a whisper. My place is about 2 miles outside town. You'll be safe there. He paused, then added with unexpected formality, I give you my word as a gentleman that you'll come to no harm under my roof. The word gentleman sounded strange coming from this rough-looking cowboy, but something in his tone made her believe him. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Jake led her to where Ranger stood patiently, then looked at the horse with a frown. He's not built for double riding, especially with a lady. He glanced around, then spotted the buckboard wagon parked behind the general store. Wait here. He returned moments later, having apparently negotiated with the store owner. Tom Henderson's lending us his wagon for the evening. Small towns, sometimes they surprise you with decency. As Jake helped her onto the wagon seat, Mary Elizabeth caught sight of her reflection in the store window. She barely recognized herself. Hair tangled, face streaked with dirt and tears, dress torn and bloody. She looked like exactly what Silas Crane had intended to make her, a broken girl with no hope left. Don't, Jake said quietly, settling beside her on the driver's bench. Don't what? Don't look at yourself like you're damaged goods. What happened back there? That's on Crane, not you. The unexpected kindness in his words nearly broke her composure entirely. She'd spent the last 6 months since her mother's death being told she was worthless, a burden, something to be sold off to pay debts that weren't even hers to begin with. As they rode through the gathering dusk, Mary Elizabeth stole glances at her rescuer. Jake Morrison looked to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too much sorrow. His hands on the reins were sure and gentle, and she noticed he wore no wedding ring. "Mr. Morrison," she began hesitantly. Jake, why did you help me? You don't know me. Crane could have killed you." Jake was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested painful memories. "I had a sister once, Sarah. She was about your age when—" He trailed off, his knuckles white as he gripped the reins. "Let's just say I know what it looks like when someone needs help, and I know what it looks like when no one comes." They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the distant howl of coyotes greeting the night. As they crested a small hill, Mary Elizabeth saw Jake's homestead spread out below them in the moonlight. It wasn't large, but it was clearly built by someone who took pride in his work. A modest log cabin with a covered porch, a well-maintained barn, and alls that looked sturdy and functional. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows, making it look like something from a dream, a real home. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Jake looked surprised. "It's nothing fancy. It looks like home," she said, then immediately felt foolish for revealing so much. But Jake seemed to understand. "Haven't had one of those in a while, have you?" "Not since my mother died." Jake helped her down from the wagon with the same careful gentleness he'd shown before. As they approached the cabin, Mary Elizabeth noticed details that spoke of a man who lived alone but with dignity: clean windows, a well-swept porch, wildflowers planted in whiskey barrels beside the steps. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but immaculately clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a comfortable-looking chair drawn up beside it. The kitchen area was functional and organized, and she could see a bedroom beyond a partially open door. "You can have the bedroom," Jake said, following her gaze. "I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't take your bed." "You can and you will." His tone brooked no argument. "First thing tomorrow, we'll get you some proper clothes and figure out what to do about Crane's claim on you." The word claim made her shudder. He said he had papers. "Papers can be challenged. Tell me about your stepfather's debt." Mary Elizabeth sank into the chair by the fire, Jake's duster still wrapped around her shoulders. "After Mother died, Theodore, my stepfather, started drinking heavily. He gambled away what little money we had, then mortgaged the house in Boston. When that wasn't enough, he sold you to Crane. He said it was the only way to keep from losing everything, that I should be grateful someone would take me on." Her voice grew bitter. "Crane said I'd work off the debt in his establishment." Jake's jaw worked silently for a moment. "That debt died with your stepfather, if he's dead. And if he's not, no man has the right to sell another human being, no matter what papers he waves around. You really think I could be free of this?" Jake knelt beside her chair, his gray eyes serious and kind. "Miss Hartwell, Mary Elizabeth, I've seen enough of the world to know that sometimes the law and justice are two different things. But I give you my word, as long as you want sanctuary here, you'll have it." Looking into his weathered face, Mary Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. But outside in the darkness, Silas Crane was already making plans to reclaim what he considered his property. What Jake Morrison couldn't have predicted was how quickly Mary Elizabeth would begin to feel like she belonged in his carefully ordered world. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, she lay still in Jake's comfortable bed, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams and trying to remember the last time she'd felt truly safe. The bedroom was simply furnished but clean, with colorful quilts on the bed and wildflowers in a mason jar on the nightstand, touches that spoke of a man who appreciated beauty even in his solitude. When she finally emerged, still wearing Jake's duster over her torn dress, she found him standing at the stove, his back to her. He'd cleaned up from the night before and wore a fresh blue chambray shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's hot and I've got biscuits in the oven." "You didn't have to cook for me." "Figured you might be hungry." He glanced over his shoulder, and she caught something in his expression, a careful assessment, as if he was checking to make sure she was really all right. "How do you feel?" "Better, thank you." She moved closer to the stove, drawn by the warmth and the comfortable domesticity of the scene. "The wounds aren't as bad as they seemed last night." "Good. I was thinking we should ride into town this morning, get you some proper clothes and supplies. Then we'll pay a visit to Judge Whitmore about those papers Crane mentioned." Mary Elizabeth felt a flutter of anxiety. What if the judge says the debt is legal? Then we'll figure out another way. Jake's voice was calm and sure. "I told you last night, I don't make promises I can't keep." As they ate breakfast together, Mary Elizabeth found herself stealing glances at this enigmatic man who'd turned her world upside down with a single act of kindness. There was something about Jake Morrison that didn't quite fit the typical cowboy mold, an educated way of speaking, careful manners, and an air of quiet authority that suggested he was accustomed to command. "Jake," she said carefully, "what did you do before you came here?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "I was a cavalry officer, Captain Jake Morrison, 5th Colorado Regiment." "The war?" "Among other things." His tone suggested the subject was closed, but then he surprised her by continuing. "I came out here afterward, bought this place with my mustering out pay. Figured I'd seen enough of civilization for one lifetime." "But you still help people, like you helped me?" Jake looked up at her then, and she saw something in his gray eyes that made her breath catch, a depth of pain and loneliness that matched her own. "Sometimes helping others is the only way to help yourself," he said quietly. After breakfast, Jake hitched Ranger to the wagon, and they set out for town. As they rode, Mary Elizabeth found herself relaxing in Jake's company. He pointed out landmarks, the creek where he sometimes fished, the meadow where wild horses grazed, the ridge where you could see clear to the mountains on a good day. His voice carried affection for this harsh but beautiful land, and she began to understand why he'd chosen solitude over society. "Tell me about Boston," Jake said as they approached the outskirts of Redemption Creek. "What would you like to know?" "Whatever you want to tell me." Mary Elizabeth considered this. Most people asked specific questions about her family's money, her father's profession, her own prospects for marriage. Jake's open-ended invitation felt like a gift. "I was a teacher," she said, "at a school for young ladies. I loved it. The books, the learning, helping the girls discover they were capable of more than they thought." She paused. "When Mother married Theodore, he said education was wasted on women. He made me quit. That must have been hard. It was like losing myself." The words came out more honestly than she'd intended. "I'd always planned to have my own school someday, maybe even write books for children. Theodore said those were foolish dreams for a woman." "They're not foolish." Jake's voice was firm. "This country needs teachers. especially out here. Schools are few and far between. The idea that her dreams might not be dead, that they might even be valuable, was so startling that Mary Elizabeth fell silent. She'd grown so accustomed to being told she was worthless that she'd almost begun to believe it. As they entered the main street of Redemption Creek, Mary Elizabeth noticed how people watched them. Some faces were curious, others disapproving. She instinctively moved closer to Jake on the wagon seat. "They're staring," she whispered. "Let them stare. You've got nothing to be ashamed of." But as they pulled up in front of the general store, Mary Elizabeth saw Silas Crane emerge from the Silver Dollar Saloon, his eyes fixed on her with an expression that made her blood run cold. He said something to the man beside him, another rough-looking character she didn't recognize, and both men started walking in their direction. Jake must have seen them too, because his hand moved casually to rest on his gun belt. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, "and remember, you're under my protection now." As Crane approached, Mary Elizabeth felt Jake's presence beside her like a shield, solid and reassuring. But she could see the calculation in Crane's eyes, the way he was sizing up the situation, looking for weaknesses. "Morrison," Crane called out when he was still 20 feet away. "We need to talk." "Nothing to talk about, Crane. The lady's with me now." "The lady," Crane said with deliberate mockery, "is my property, bought and paid for. I got the papers to prove it." Jake stepped down from the wagon and moved to Mary Elizabeth's side, his every movement radiating controlled danger. "Then I guess we'll let Judge Whitmore sort it out." Crane's smile was cruel and confident. "Funny you should mention the judge. See, I already paid him a visit this morning." And that's when Mary Elizabeth realized that her nightmare was far from over. What Mary Elizabeth hadn't counted on was how quickly hope could turn to despair with just a few well-chosen words. "Judge Whitmore examined my papers real careful-like," Crane continued, his voice carrying across the dusty street loud enough for gathering onlookers to hear. "Turns out Theodore Hartwell's debt was legally transferred to me, and that includes all collateral." His eyes fixed on Mary Elizabeth with predatory satisfaction. "That means the girl comes with me, Morrison. Today." Mary Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. Around them, a small crowd had gathered. Shopkeepers, farmers, even a few women from the church auxiliary. She could see the mixture of curiosity and judgment in their faces, and she knew exactly what they were thinking. Fallen woman, damaged goods, not worth the trouble. Jake's stance didn't change, but Mary Elizabeth could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. Papers can be forged, Crane, and even if they're genuine, no judge worth his salt would uphold a contract that treats a human being like livestock. That's where you're wrong. Crane pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and waved it in the air. Judge Whitmore's signature is right here, making the transfer legal under territorial law. The girl works for me until the debt's paid, all $1,500 of it. $1,500. Mary Elizabeth's heart sank. It might as well have been 15,000, an impossible sum that would keep her trapped forever. There's another option, Crane added, his smile turning even more vicious. If someone wanted to buy out the contract, I might be willing to negotiate, for the right price. How much? Jake asked, his voice deadly quiet. 2,000. Cash. It was an outrageous sum, designed to be impossible. Mary Elizabeth saw the calculation in Jake's eyes and felt sick. He was a rancher, not a wealthy man. Whatever savings he had would never cover such an amount. You son of a... Jake started forward, but Mary Elizabeth caught his arm. Don't, she whispered. It's not worth it. I'm not worth it. Jake turned to look at her, and the expression in his gray eyes was so fierce it took her breath away. Don't you ever say that again. Ever. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "What's all this commotion about?" Sheriff Tom Bradley pushed through the crowd, his weathered face stern but not unkind. Mary Elizabeth had heard he was one of the few honest lawmen in this part of Colorado, but she also knew that honest didn't always mean sympathetic to a woman's plight. "Just collecting my property, Sheriff," Crane said smoothly. "Got the papers right here, all legal and signed by Judge Whitmore." Sheriff Bradley examined the documents, his expression unreadable. Mary Elizabeth held her breath, praying for some miracle that would invalidate Crane's claim. "Looks official," the sheriff said finally, "but I've got some concerns about the circumstances." "What kind of concerns?" Crane's confidence wavered slightly. "The kind that involve grown men beating young women with leather straps. That sort of thing tends to upset the decent folks in my town. She's my employee now. I got the right to discipline. You got the right to reasonable correction, not to beat someone half to death. And from what I heard, you were doing the latter." Sheriff Bradley folded the papers and handed them back to Crane. "I'll tell you what's going to happen. The girl stays with Morrison for now. If you want to pursue your legal claim, you file it proper-like with the territorial court in Denver, but there'll be no more beatings in my town. Are we clear?" Crane's face darkened with rage, but he couldn't openly defy the sheriff. "Fine. But this ain't over. The girl still belongs to me, and I'll get her back." As Crane stalked away, Mary Elizabeth felt weak with relief. It was temporary, she knew, but it was something. "Thank you, Sheriff," Jake said. "Don't thank me yet. Crane's papers look genuine, and Judge Whitmore's signature is real. I know his hand." Bradley's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "You've bought some time, but unless you can prove fraud or come up with that money, the girl will have to go with him eventually." After the sheriff left and the crowd dispersed, Jake and Mary Elizabeth continued with their shopping in heavy silence. At the general store, Jake bought her a practical traveling dress, undergarments, and a warm coat, all of which Mary Elizabeth accepted with growing guilt. Every dollar he spent on her was money he couldn't afford to lose. "Jake, I can't let you do this," she said as he paid for the purchases. "That's $2,000. It's impossible." "Nothing's impossible. There are ways to raise money quickly if you're willing to take risks." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. "What kind of risks?" "There's a poker game every Friday night at the Silver Dollar. High stakes, big money." Jake's expression was grim. "I used to be pretty good at cards back in my Army days." "Gambling?" "Jake, that's exactly what got my stepfather into this mess in the first place." "Sometimes it's the only way out of a mess, too." Mary Elizabeth grabbed his arm, feeling desperate. "What if you lose? What if you make everything worse?" Jake covered her hand with his, and she felt the calloused warmth of his palm. "Then at least I'll have tried. Mary Elizabeth, I can't just let Crane take you. I won't." "But why? Why does it matter so much to you?" For a moment, Jake was quiet, his gray eyes distant with memory. Then he said softly, "Because someone should have fought for my sister Sarah, and no one did. Maybe if they had, she'd still be alive." The pain in his voice broke Mary Elizabeth's heart. She was beginning to understand that Jake Morrison wasn't just saving her. He was trying to save himself from the guilt of a past he couldn't change. But as they loaded their purchases into the wagon, neither of them noticed Silas Crane watching from the saloon window, or the cold smile spreading across his face. He had plans for Friday night, too. What Jake Morrison hadn't anticipated was how much Mary Elizabeth would change his carefully structured life in just 3 days. By Thursday morning, she'd quietly taken over the cooking, and Jake found himself looking forward to meals for the first time in years. She'd also cleaned his already tidy cabin until it positively gleamed, organized his books by author, and even planted some late-season wildflowers around the porch. Most surprisingly, she'd begun teaching him small things: how to make his coffee taste better, how to mend his shirts so the repairs were nearly invisible, how to laugh at her gentle teasing about his bachelor habits. "You know," she said over breakfast that morning, "I found 3 different kinds of coffee in your pantry. Were you planning to open your own store?" "I keep forgetting what I have," Jake admitted, feeling oddly embarrassed. "I'm not used to having someone around to notice things like that." "Well, I noticed, and I organized your tool shed yesterday." Mary Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Did you know you own 4 hammers? A man needs backup hammers." "4 backups? You never know when you might need to hammer something really important." Mary Elizabeth laughed, a sound so bright and genuine it made something tight in Jake's chest loosen. He realized he'd been holding his breath for months, maybe years, and she was teaching him how to breathe again. But the shadow of tomorrow's poker game hung over everything. "Jake," Mary Elizabeth said, turning serious, "I've been thinking about this gambling plan, and I don't like it. We've been through this. No, listen to me. What if there's another way?" She leaned forward, her golden brown eyes intense. "What if we could prove the papers are fraudulent? Or find evidence that Theodore didn't have the legal right to put me up as collateral?" Jake considered this. "It's possible, but we'd need access to records in Boston, maybe even Philadelphia, where Theodore originally borrowed the money. That could take months." "Then what about the debt itself? $1,500 seems excessive for a small house mortgage and some gambling debts." "You think Crane inflated the amount?" "I think Silas Crane is exactly the type of man who would see a desperate situation and make it worse for his own profit." Mary Elizabeth's voice carried a sharp edge that surprised Jake. "And I think there might be people in town who know more about his business dealings than they're letting on." Jake studied her face, seeing intelligence and determination that reminded him forcibly that she'd been a teacher, accustomed to solving problems and thinking her way through difficulties. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to talk to the women in town. Crane frequents the saloon, but he also does business at the general store, the bank, probably the hotel. Men might be afraid to cross him, but women often see things differently." She paused. "And women talk to each other." It was a good idea, better than risking everything on cards. "All right, we'll try your way first. But Mary Elizabeth," Jake's voice grew serious, "if we can't find what we need by tomorrow night, I'm still playing in that game." "I understand, but Jake, promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that whatever happens, you won't blame yourself. You've already done more for me than anyone has in my entire life." The sincerity in her voice nearly undid him. Jake reached across the table and covered her hand with his, marveling at how small and delicate it felt, yet knowing it belonged to someone stronger than she looked. "Mary Elizabeth, I need to tell you something." "What?" "These past few days, having you here, it's changed things for me. I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone to talk to share meals with, to—" he struggled for the right words, "to care about someone again." Mary Elizabeth's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't pull her hand away. "For me too. Jake, I know this started as just you helping someone in trouble, but it stopped being just that the moment you smiled at me." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped across the worn wooden table, both of them acknowledging that something profound had shifted between them. "We should get into town," Mary Elizabeth said finally. "If we're going to do this, we need to start talking to people." The first stop was Henderson's general store, where Mary Elizabeth engaged Mrs. Henderson in conversation, while Jake pretended to examine horse tack. Within minutes, Mary Elizabeth had learned that Crane regularly received large packages at the store, packages that came with no return address and were always paid for in cash. At the bank, the teller's wife mentioned that Crane made frequent deposits, but never seemed to have legitimate business to account for such income. At the hotel, the desk clerk's daughter revealed that Crane often entertained business associates who looked more like outlaws than legitimate businessmen. By afternoon, they had a picture of Silas Crane as a man involved in activities that went far beyond simple money lending. "It's not enough to invalidate the contract," Jake said, as they sat in the wagon outside the church. "But it suggests Crane might be vulnerable to pressure from the territorial authorities." "Or," Mary Elizabeth said thoughtfully, "it suggests he has enough to lose that he might be willing to negotiate if we approach this right." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we don't need to prove the contract is invalid. Maybe we just need to make Crane believe we can cause him bigger problems than I'm worth." Jake stared at her with growing admiration. "Mary Elizabeth Hartwell, you are far more devious than you look." "I'm a school teacher, Jake. We're trained to outthink troublemakers." But as they headed home in the gathering dusk, neither of them saw the figure watching from the shadows behind the livery stable, or realized that their inquiries had been noted and reported back to Silas Crane. And Crane was not the sort of man who appreciated being investigated. What Mary Elizabeth discovered that night was that safety was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the sound of horses approaching in the darkness. She woke to Jake's hand on her shoulder, gentle but urgent. "Mary Elizabeth, wake up. We've got trouble." Instantly alert, she sat up in bed and listened. Outside, she could hear the soft nickering of horses and the creak of leather saddles, sounds that didn't belong in the peaceful quiet of Jake's homestead. "How many?" she whispered. "3, maybe 4. They're trying to be quiet, but Ranger's been restless for the past 10 minutes. Jake was already dressed and armed, his Colt strapped to his hip and a rifle in his hands. "I need you to get dressed quickly and quietly. Can you do that?" Mary Elizabeth nodded, fear making her movements quick and efficient. She pulled on the traveling dress Jake had bought her, her hands trembling only slightly as she fastened the buttons. "What do we do?" "There's a root cellar behind the cabin, hidden by a patch of sagebrush. If shooting starts, you run for it, and you don't look back. Understand?" "Jake, I can't just leave you." "Yes, you can, and you will." His voice brooked no argument. "This is about you, Mary Elizabeth. They're not here for me." Outside, a voice called out through the darkness, Silas Crane's voice, carrying false joviality that fooled no one. "Morrison, I know you're in there. We just want to talk." Jake moved to the window and peered carefully through a gap in the curtains. "Crane's got 3 men with him, all armed. They've spread out around the cabin." "Can we get to the horses?" "Not without crossing open ground. They'd cut us down before we made it halfway to the barn." Mary Elizabeth felt panic rising in her throat, but she forced it down. This was not the time to fall apart. Jake needed her to be strong, and she would not let him down. "Morrison!" Crane called again. "I'm losing patience. Send the girl out and nobody has to get hurt." Jake cupped his hands around his mouth and called back, "The girl stays with me, Crane. Find yourself another victim." "You're outnumbered 4-1, Captain. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The use of Jake's military rank made Mary Elizabeth look at him sharply. She saw his jaw tighten with recognition. "You know who that is, don't you?" she whispered. "Tobias Creek. He was a sergeant in my unit during the war. I had him court-martialed for murdering prisoners." Jake's voice was grim. "Looks like he's found himself new employment. Will he try to take you alive?" "Creek? No, this is personal for him." The situation had just become infinitely more dangerous. This wasn't just about Crane's contract anymore. It was about revenge. Jake, there has to be another way out of this. Before Jake could respond, the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the night air. The bullet splintered the wood near the window, and Jake pulled Mary Elizabeth away from the wall. "Negotiation time's over," he said grimly. "Mary Elizabeth, I need you to listen carefully. In exactly 60 seconds, I'm going out the front door. When I do, you go out the back and head for that root cellar. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't come out until you hear my voice calling for you." "Jake, no. They'll kill you." "Maybe. But if I don't draw them away from the cabin, they'll eventually rush us both. And then we'll both die." Jake cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes intense. "I can't live with that. I won't watch another woman I care about get hurt because I wasn't strong enough to protect her." "Another woman you care about?" Despite everything, Jake's mouth curved in a slight smile. "Mary Elizabeth, I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you looked up at me in that dirt, with hope in your eyes." The declaration hit her like a physical blow. Here, in the midst of mortal danger, he was telling her something she'd secretly hoped to hear, but never expected. "Jake, Don't say anything now. Just promise me you'll run when I tell you to." Another rifle shot shattered the night, followed by Crane's voice. "That was a warning shot, Morrison. The next one won't be." Mary Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I promise I'll run. But Jake Morrison, you better survive this, because I have something to say to you when it's over." "What?" "I love you too, and I'll be damned if I'm going to lose you now." Jake stared at her for a moment, then kissed her hard and quick. "Well then, I guess I better make sure I don't get shot." He moved to the door, checking his weapons one final time. Mary Elizabeth positioned herself near the back exit, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Ready?" Jake asked. Mary Elizabeth nodded, though ready was the last thing she felt. Jake took a deep breath, then kicked open the front door and dove into the night, his rifle blazing. And Mary Elizabeth ran into the darkness, Jake's gunfire covering her escape, praying to every saint she'd ever heard of that the man she loved would still be alive when dawn came. What Jake Morrison had learned in 5 years of cavalry service was that sometimes the best defense was a completely insane offense. He hit the ground rolling as he came through the door, rifle fire erupting from 4 different positions around his cabin. Wood splintered above his head as he dove behind the water trough, bullets whining through the air like angry hornets. His own rifle barked twice, and he heard a yelp from the direction of the barn. 1 down, 3 to go. "Spread out!" Crane's voice bellowed through the gunfire. "Don't let him pin us down!" Jake grinned fiercely in the darkness. Pin them down. He was outnumbered 4 to 1 and surrounded. But Creek and his boys were thinking like outlaws, not soldiers, and that was their first mistake. He rolled left, came up firing, then immediately moved again. The muzzle flashes from his rifle lit up his position, but he was never there long enough for return fire to be effective. It was a technique he'd learned fighting Cheyenne war parties. Keep moving, make them guess, never give them a stationary target. A bullet creased his left shoulder, burning like a brand, but Jake ignored the pain and kept moving. He could hear Mary Elizabeth's footsteps fading into the distance and felt a surge of relief. Whatever happened to him, she was getting away. "Morrison," Creek's voice cut through the noise. "You always were too clever for your own good, but this time you're trapped, and I'm going to enjoy watching you die." "Come and try it, Creek," Jake called back, ejecting spent cartridges and reloading with practiced efficiency. "You were a coward then, and you're a coward now." The insult had its desired effect. Creek rose from cover behind the corral fence and charged, howling like a madman. Jake's rifle spoke once and Creek spun and fell, clutching his leg, but the distraction cost Jake. While he was focused on Creek, one of Crane's other men had circled around behind the cabin. Jake sensed movement behind him and threw himself sideways just as a rifle cracked. The bullet that would have taken his head instead tore through his right arm, and his rifle went spinning into the darkness. Jake rolled and came up with his Colt, but his wounded arm made his draw clumsy. The man behind the cabin, a thin, weasel-faced individual Jake didn't recognize, was already aiming for a killing shot. That's when Mary Elizabeth stepped out of the shadows behind him and brought a piece of firewood down on the back of his skull. The man dropped like a sack of grain. "I thought I told you to run," Jake shouted, relief and exasperation warring in his voice. "I did run. I ran to get a weapon." Mary Elizabeth hefted the chunk of wood like a club, her golden brown eyes fierce with protective fury. "No one shoots the man I love and gets away with it." Despite the desperate situation, Jake felt his heart soar. This woman, this gentle, refined Eastern schoolteacher, had just cold-cocked an armed outlaw to protect him. "Behind you!" Mary Elizabeth screamed. Jake spun and fired, his shot taking down another of Crane's men who'd been creeping along the side of the cabin. That left just Crane himself, who was now alone and significantly outnumbered. "Crane!" Jake called out. "Your boys are down. Time to negotiate." "Go to hell, Morrison." A rifle shot from the direction of the barn answered Jake's offer, but the bullet went wide. Crane was rattled now, shooting wild. "Mary Elizabeth, get back inside," Jake said quietly. "Not a chance. This is not the time to argue with me. Then don't give me orders I won't follow." Any other time Jake might have admired her spirit. Right now he was too worried about keeping her alive to appreciate her stubborn courage. He was considering his options when a new voice cut through the night, Sheriff Bradley, calling from the direction of the road. "This is the law. Everybody put down your weapons." Jake saw torchlight approaching and felt hope surge in his chest. Someone in town must have heard the gunfire and gone for help. "Sheriff!" Jake called out. "Jake Morrison here. Silas Crane and his boys attacked my place." "Crane," Bradley's voice carried clear authority. "You're surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender now and nobody else has to die tonight." There was a long moment of silence from the barn. Then Crane's voice, sullen and defeated. "I'm throwing out my rifle." Jake sagged with relief as Crane's rifle came sailing out of the barn, followed by Crane himself, hands raised. The crisis was over. But as Sheriff Bradley and his deputies moved in to secure the scene, Jake realized that tonight had changed everything. The woman beside him had proven she was willing to fight for him, even at the risk of her own life. And somewhere in the chaos of gunfire and fear, he'd discovered that love wasn't just about protection. It was about partnership. "Mary Elizabeth," he said softly. "Yes?" "Remind me never to make you really angry." She looked at him, dirt-streaked and fierce, still holding her makeshift weapon, and smiled. "I'll try to remember that the next time you order me to run away and hide." And despite his wounded arm and the bodies scattered around his yard, Jake Morrison found himself laughing. What Mary Elizabeth hadn't expected was how quickly justice could move when the right person was motivated to see it done. Sheriff Bradley stood in Jake's kitchen the next morning, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands and a stack of papers on the table before him. Mary Elizabeth sat beside Jake, professionally bandaging his wounded arm with strips torn from one of his old shirts. The doctor had been and gone, declaring both wounds painful but not serious. "Interesting thing happened after we locked up Crane and his boys," Bradley said, settling back in his chair. Creek started talking. Seems he figured his best chance was to cooperate. "What did he say?" Jake asked, wincing as Mary Elizabeth tightened the bandage. Told us all about Crane's little business operation. Turns out your instincts were right, Miss Hartwell. Those papers weren't exactly on the up and up. Mary Elizabeth's hand stilled on Jake's arm. What do you mean? Creek said Crane's been running a scam for the better part of 2 years. He'd approach desperate men with gambling debts, offer to loan them money at reasonable rates, then manufacture evidence of much larger debts after the borrowers died or disappeared. Bradley took a long sip of coffee. Your stepfather borrowed $500 from Crane. The $1,500 debt was pure fiction. Relief flooded through Mary Elizabeth so powerfully she felt dizzy. So the contract is invalid? More than invalid, it's criminal fraud. I've already wired the Territorial Marshal's office. They're sending someone to investigate Crane's entire operation. Jake leaned back in his chair, his good hand finding Mary Elizabeth's. What about the original $500 debt? Theodore Hartwell paid that off 3 months before he died, according to Creek. Crane kept the receipt and just pretended the debt was still active. Mary Elizabeth felt tears welling up in her eyes. Not tears of sadness this time, but of pure, overwhelming relief. I'm really free? Free as a bird, miss. Crane won't be bothering anyone for a long time. After Sheriff Bradley left, Mary Elizabeth and Jake sat in companionable silence, both of them absorbing the magnitude of what had changed. The threat that had brought them together was gone, leaving them to figure out what came next. So, Jake said eventually, I guess you'll want to head back east now. Boston, maybe, or somewhere else where you can teach again. Mary Elizabeth turned to study his profile, noting the careful neutrality in his voice. Is that what you want me to do? I want you to do whatever makes you happy. That's not what I asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring at his bandaged arm. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft she had to lean closer to hear him. Mary Elizabeth, I'm a rancher living in the middle of nowhere. I've got a small spread, a modest income, and more emotional baggage than any woman should have to deal with. You're educated, refined, capable of doing anything you set your mind to. Why would you want to tie yourself down to someone like me? Mary Elizabeth felt her heart break a little at the doubt in his voice. Jake Morrison, are you trying to talk me out of loving you? I'm trying to be realistic about what I can offer you. Then let me be realistic too. Mary Elizabeth turned in her chair to face him directly. I spent 23 years being told what I should want and who I should be. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want and exactly who I am when I'm with you. Mary Elizabeth, I want to wake up to the smell of your coffee every morning. I want to argue with you about how many hammers one man really needs. I want to help you build something here, not just a ranch, but a home, a family, a future. She paused, then added with a small smile, and I want to start a school for the children in this area, because you're right. They need education, and I need to teach. Jake stared at her, hope and disbelief warring in his gray eyes. Are you proposing to me, Miss Hartwell? I suppose I am, Mr. Morrison. What's your answer? Instead of answering with words, Jake stood up, pulled her to her feet with his good arm, and kissed her with a passion that left no room for doubt about his feelings. When they finally broke apart, Mary Elizabeth was breathless and slightly dizzy. Is that a yes? She asked. That's a hell yes, if you'll pardon the language. Mary Elizabeth laughed. I think I can forgive one small curse under the circumstances. Good, because there's something else I need to say. What? I love you, Mary Elizabeth Hartwell. I love your courage, your intelligence, your stubborn streak, and the way you look when you're planning to reform my bachelor ways. I love you too, Jake Morrison. All of you, the parts that are broken, and the parts that are healing, and the parts that make me feel like I'm finally home. They spent the rest of the morning making plans, talking about when to have the wedding, how to expand the cabin, where to build the schoolhouse. It was the most natural thing in the world, this planning of a shared future, as if they'd been meant for it all along. But as Mary Elizabeth sat in Jake's arms, watching the sun climb higher over the Colorado mountains, she couldn't help but think about how close they'd come to never having this chance at all. Sometimes the best things in life came disguised as the worst disasters. What Jake Morrison discovered 3 months later was that married life was simultaneously exactly what he'd expected and nothing like he'd imagined. The wedding had been simple. Sheriff Bradley officiating in Jake's cabin, with Tom Henderson and his wife as witnesses. Mary Elizabeth had worn a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric bought at Henderson's store, and Jake had never seen anything more beautiful. They'd exchanged plain gold bands purchased from the same store, and Jake had surprised himself by how much the simple ceremony meant to him. Now, as he watched his wife teach reading lessons to 8 local children in the new schoolroom they'd built onto the side of the cabin, Jake marveled at how completely she'd transformed his life without changing the essential nature of who he was. "Mr. Morrison," called out 9-year-old Tommy Henderson, "Mrs. Morrison says you know all about the cavalry. Will you tell us about fighting Indians?" Mary Elizabeth looked up from the slate she was cleaning, one eyebrow raised in amusement. "I said no such thing, Thomas Henderson. I said Mr. Morrison served in the cavalry. That's quite different from saying he fought Indians." "But he did, didn't he?" pressed little Sarah Wells, whose family had just arrived from Missouri. Jake set down the piece of harness he'd been mending and considered his answer carefully. Mary Elizabeth had taught him to think before speaking around the children. They absorbed everything and repeated it at home, often out of context. "I served my country during a difficult time," he said finally. "The most important thing I learned was that there are good people and bad people in every group, and fighting should always be the last choice, not the first one." "But you did fight sometimes," Tommy persisted. "Sometimes. But the bravest thing I ever did wasn't fighting. It was learning when to stop fighting." Mary Elizabeth smiled at him, and Jake felt that familiar warmth in his chest. She'd taught him that courage wasn't just about facing down gunfighters or charging into battle. Sometimes it took more courage to open your heart and trust someone with it. After the children left for the day, Jake and Mary Elizabeth sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. It had become their favorite time of day, when the chores were done and they could simply enjoy each other's company. "Letter came from Boston today," Mary Elizabeth said, producing an envelope from her apron pocket. "Your cousin Rebecca?" She says the family is still scandalized by my decision to marry a rough Western cowboy and live in primitive conditions." Mary Elizabeth's voice carried amusement rather than hurt. "She wants to know if I'm terribly unhappy and desperate to come home." "Are you?" Jake asked, only half joking. Mary Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, fitting perfectly into the curve of his arm. "Jake Morrison, look around you. We have a beautiful home, work that matters, children who are learning to read and write, and each other. How could I possibly be unhappy? Your family might have a point about the primitive conditions. We're not exactly living in luxury. Luxury is relative. I'd rather have a one-room cabin with you than a mansion with anyone else." Jake kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "You know what I love most about you?" "What?" "You see things as they really are, not as you think they should be." "Is that your way of saying I'm practical?" "It's my way of saying you're perfect." Mary Elizabeth laughed. "I'm not perfect, Jake Morrison. I burn biscuits, I'm stubborn as a mule, and I have entirely too many opinions about how you should organize your tools." "Exactly. Perfect." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Jake still sometimes had to pinch himself to believe this was his life now, that he'd found someone who not only loved him but understood him, who made him want to be a better man without ever making him feel like he wasn't good enough as he was. "Jake," Mary Elizabeth said suddenly. Do you ever think about Silas Crane?" The question surprised him. They rarely talked about the events that had brought them together. "Sometimes. Why?" "I was thinking today about how afraid I was, and how hopeless everything seemed. If someone had told me then that I'd end up here, this happy, I never would have believed it. Bad things can lead to good things, if you're willing to see the possibilities." "Do you think Crane did us a favor, in a twisted sort of way?" Jake considered this. "I think you would have found your way to happiness eventually, with or without Crane. But I'm grateful it happened the way it did, because it brought you to me. And I'm grateful you were the kind of man who couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. I told you before, sometimes helping others is the only way to help yourself. You saved me just as much as I saved you, Mary Elizabeth. Maybe more." As full darkness settled over their homestead, Jake and Mary Elizabeth went inside to their warm, lamp-lit cabin. They'd expanded it over the past few months, adding a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen, but it still felt cozy and intimate rather than grand. "I love our life," Mary Elizabeth said, as she began braiding her hair for bed. "Even when the wind howls and the snow piles up to the windows? Especially then. That's when I get to stay inside with you and plan all the improvements we'll make come spring." Jake grinned. "Speaking of improvements, I've been thinking about that chicken coop you wanted." "Really?" "Really. A woman who can knock out an armed outlaw with a piece of firewood deserves all the chickens she wants." Mary Elizabeth turned from the mirror and kissed him soundly. "Jacob Morrison, you are the most wonderful man alive." And as Jake held his wife in their comfortable bed, listening to the familiar night sounds of their homestead, he reflected that sometimes the best things in life came when you stopped looking for them and started looking out for other people instead. The girl he'd saved had saved him right back, and together they'd built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows. What Mary Elizabeth Morrison hadn't counted on was how much one letter could change everything, arriving on a crisp October morning exactly 1 year after Jake had first saved her from Silas Crane's brutality. She was teaching the children their arithmetic lessons when Tom Henderson arrived with the mail, his expression unusually serious. The letter he handed her bore the official seal of the Colorado Territorial Government, and Mary Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat. "Children, please work on the problems I've written on the slate," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll be right back." She stepped outside where Jake was repairing a section of fence, the letter trembling in her hands. "What is it?" Jake asked, immediately noting her expression. "It's from the territorial government, official business." She handed him the letter, her hands shaking slightly. "I'm afraid to open it." Jake took the envelope and studied the seal. Could be about Crane's trial, or maybe something about his other victims. The marshal said they were trying to track down everyone he'd defrauded. Or it could be something terrible. What if they've decided our marriage isn't legal because of the circumstances? What if... "Hey." Jake set his tools aside and pulled her into his arms. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it together. That's what married people do." Mary Elizabeth nodded, taking strength from his solid presence. "Open it." Jake broke the seal and unfolded the official document, his eyes scanning the formal language. As he read, his expression shifted from concern to surprise to something that looked almost like awe. "Mary Elizabeth," he said slowly, "you're not going to believe this." "What does it say?" It's from the Territorial Marshal's office. They've been investigating Crane's operation for the past year, and they've recovered a substantial amount of stolen money and property. Jake looked up at her, his gray eyes bright with amazement. They're issuing restitution payments to all of Crane's victims. How much? $3,000. Mary Elizabeth felt her knees go weak. 3,000? Jake, that's more money than we've ever dreamed of having. There's more. The territorial government is also offering land grants to families willing to establish schools in underserved areas. As a qualified teacher married to an established rancher, we're eligible for an additional 500 acres of prime grazing land. Mary Elizabeth stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying we've just gone from struggling homesteaders to one of the more prosperous families in the territory. And you, Mrs. Morrison, are about to become the most successful school teacher in Colorado. Before Mary Elizabeth could respond, 8 young voices called out from the schoolroom, "Mrs. Morrison, we finished our arithmetic." She looked at Jake, then at the letter, then back at Jake, and suddenly began to laugh, not from amusement, but from pure, overwhelming joy mixed with disbelief. "I have to get back to the children," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Mary Elizabeth?" "Yes?" "What do you want to do with the money?" Without hesitation, she said, "Build a real school, with proper desks and a library, and maybe even a small dormitory for children who live too far away to come daily." Jake's smile was radiant. "I should have known you'd want to spend a fortune on other people's children." "Not all of it. I was thinking we might use some to expand the house, maybe add a few more bedrooms." "Planning ahead for students to board with us?" Mary Elizabeth blushed prettily. "Actually, I was thinking more about our own children, someday." Jake's expression grew soft and tender. "Mary Elizabeth Morrison, are you telling me you want to have babies with me?" "Several babies, if you're agreeable to the idea." Jake picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, right there in the yard where anyone might see. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you too. Now put me down before the children see us acting like fools and lose all respect for their teacher." But it was too late for that. 8 young faces were pressed against the schoolroom window, giggling at the sight of their teacher and her husband celebrating in the yard. "Mrs. Morrison," Tommy Henderson called out, "are you and Mr. Morrison going to have babies?" Mary Elizabeth's face turned scarlet, but Jake just laughed. "Maybe someday, son. Right now, we're just happy about some good news." "What kind of good news?" asked Sarah Wells. Mary Elizabeth exchanged a look with Jake, then made a decision. These children had become like family to her over the past year, and they deserved to share in the joy. "The kind of good news that means we're going to build you a real school," she said, "with a bell tower and a library and everything." The children erupted in cheers, and soon they were all outside, dancing around the yard and pestering Jake and Mary Elizabeth with questions about the new school. As the afternoon sun slanted across their homestead, painting everything in golden light, Mary Elizabeth watched Jake patiently answer each child's questions about construction and timelines. This man who'd been so alone and wounded when she met him was now surrounded by children who adored him, talking animatedly about the future they were all going to build together. "Mrs. Morrison," little Sarah Wells tugged on her skirt, "will you still be our teacher in the new school?" "If you want me to be." "Forever and ever?" Mary Elizabeth glanced at Jake, who was showing Tommy Henderson how to measure boards for the new school building, and felt her heart overflow with contentment. "Forever and ever." And as the first stars began to appear in the Colorado sky, Mary Elizabeth Morrison knew that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with the darkest chapters, and that redemption could come in forms you never expected, in the kindness of a stranger, the love of a good man, and the trust of children who believed you could make their dreams come true. But there was still one more surprise waiting, one that would test everything they'd built together. What Mary Elizabeth Morrison learned 18 months later was that love wasn't just about the big dramatic moments. It was about choosing each other every day through ordinary joys and unexpected challenges. The new school had been completed in the spring, a beautiful 2-story building with the promised bell tower and library. Children came from as far as 20 miles away, some boarding with local families during the week. Mary Elizabeth had 3 additional teachers working with her now, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air from dawn until dusk. Their expanded ranch house was equally bustling. Jake had been right about Mary Elizabeth wanting to spend their fortune on other people. They'd taken in 2 orphaned siblings from town, and the spare bedrooms rarely stayed empty long. Word had spread that the Morrisons would help anyone in genuine need, and their dinner table regularly accommodated unexpected guests. But it was the quiet moments Mary Elizabeth treasured most, like this evening as she sat on the porch watching Jake teach 7-year-old Peter Wells how to whittle. The boy's parents had died in a spring flood, and he'd been staying with them for 3 months now. Jake's patience with him was infinite, his gentle corrections offered with the same care he'd once shown to Mary Elizabeth herself. Mrs. Morrison, 12-year-old Anna Schmidt, appeared at her elbow, speaking in the careful English Mary Elizabeth had been teaching her. Anna and her younger brother Hans had arrived from Germany 6 months ago, orphaned and speaking no English. Now Anna helped teach the younger children while learning advanced mathematics and literature herself. "Yes, dear." The letter came today, from the territorial capital. Mary Elizabeth's heart skipped. They'd been waiting for months to hear whether the territorial government would approve their application to become an official children's home in addition to a school. The red tape had been formidable, but if approved, they'd receive funding to help even more orphaned and abandoned children. "Good news or bad news?" Mary Elizabeth asked. Anna's serious face broke into a rare smile. "Good news. We are approved. They send money for 10 more children, and they want to send inspector to see how we do things here. They say maybe other places can learn from us." Mary Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes. "Anna, that's wonderful." "Yes, but there is something else." "What?" "The inspector. He is coming next month, and he is bringing with him a young woman teacher from Boston. She wants to learn our methods." Something about Anna's tone made Mary Elizabeth look at her sharply. "Anna, what aren't you telling me?" "The teacher. Her name is Rebecca Hartwell. She says she is your cousin." Mary Elizabeth's breath caught. Rebecca, the cousin who'd been so scandalized by her marriage, who'd written pitying letters about primitive conditions and rough Western cowboys. Did the letter say why she's coming? She wants to see if Western education methods might be, how do you say, suitable for Eastern schools. Anna paused, then added with the directness of youth, "I think maybe she wants to see if you are really happy, or just pretending to be." That evening, after the children were settled for the night, Mary Elizabeth shared the news with Jake. They sat in their bedroom, finally private after a day filled with other people's needs, and she watched his face as she explained about Rebecca's impending visit. "Are you worried about what she'll think?" Jake asked. "I was, for about 5 minutes. Then I realized I don't care what she thinks." Mary Elizabeth curled up against his side, marveling as she always did at how perfectly she fit there. "Jake, when I think about the woman I was 2 years ago, so afraid, so convinced I was worthless. I barely recognize her. You were never worthless. You were just convinced you were by people who were wrong. But I believed them. I thought my dreams were foolish, that I'd never amount to anything more than an unwanted burden. She tilted her head to look at him. Now look at us. We have a school that's becoming a model for the entire territory. We're providing homes for children who need them. We're building something that matters. We are indeed. Jake's voice carried quiet pride. And when your fancy Boston cousin sees what you've accomplished, she's going to realize she's been wrong about everything. Mary Elizabeth considered this. You know what I hope? What? I hope she sees that happiness isn't about having the biggest house or the most fashionable clothes. I hope she sees that it's about knowing your life has meaning, about being loved for who you really are, about going to bed tired from good work and waking up eager to do more. Jake kissed the top of her head. She'll see all that because she'll see you. And she'll see that the scared girl who left Boston has become a woman who changes lives. 3 weeks later, Rebecca Hartwell arrived on the stage from Denver, accompanied by the territorial inspector. Mary Elizabeth watched from the school window as her cousin stepped down, elegant in her traveling suit and clearly expecting the worst from her primitive surroundings. But as the day progressed, Mary Elizabeth saw Rebecca's expression change. She watched Rebecca observe classes where children of 6 different nationalities learned together, their faces bright with eagerness. She saw Rebecca's amazement at the school's library, stocked with over 500 books purchased with the Crane restitution money. She watched Rebecca meet the orphaned children who'd found family with the Morrisons, all of them clean, well-fed, and clearly loved. Most of all, she watched Rebecca observe Mary Elizabeth herself, confident, authoritative, respected by children and adults alike, radiating the quiet contentment of a woman who'd found her place in the world. At dinner that evening, with the long table surrounded by their extended family of students and temporary residents, Rebecca finally spoke. Mary Elizabeth, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, Rebecca. Yes, I do. I thought you'd made a terrible mistake, throwing your life away on all this. She gestured around the table. I was wrong. You didn't throw your life away. You found it. Mary Elizabeth reached across the table and squeezed her cousin's hand. We all find happiness in different ways. I'm just grateful I found mine. Later that evening, as Jake and Mary Elizabeth walked hand in hand around their property, checking on the horses and enjoying the peaceful Colorado evening, Mary Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Jake, do you ever think about that night when you first found me? Sometimes. Why? I was so broken then. I thought my life was over, that I'd never be anything more than someone's victim. She stopped walking and turned to face him. If someone had told me then that someday I'd be running a school, raising children, married to the most wonderful man alive, I would have thought they were lying. And if someone had told me that saving one girl would end up saving me right back, I'd have thought the same thing. Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. Mary Elizabeth, you didn't just become my wife. You became my partner in everything that matters. We make a good team. The best. As they stood there in the starlight, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Mary Elizabeth thought about the title Rebecca had suggested for the article she wanted to write about their school. From Desperation to Hope, a Western success story. It was accurate as far as it went. But Mary Elizabeth knew the real story was simpler and more profound than that. It was about discovering that love, real, lasting, transformative love, could heal wounds that seemed beyond repair and create possibilities that seemed impossible. The girl who'd been whipped in the dust behind a saloon had become a woman who helped others find their way to better lives. The man who'd lived in solitary grief had become a father figure to dozens of children who needed him. Together, they'd built something beautiful from the ruins of their separate sorrows. And every morning when Mary Elizabeth woke up beside the man who'd saved her life by risking his own, she remembered the lesson that had taken her so long to learn. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the darkest chapters, and redemption really can come riding in on a dusty trail when you least expect it. I hope this story has touched your heart and reminded you that no matter how dark things might seem, love and kindness can transform everything. If you enjoyed this tale of Jake and Mary Elizabeth, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories from the Wild West. Until next time, remember that your own redemption story might be just around the corner.